To celebrate hitting 1,000 subscribers, I put up a community poll for what the next tier list should be, with 3 options. In a distant third was the mixed drink tier list across the franchise. In a not-so-distant second was the Dead Rising 1 weapons tier list, which lost out to the Survivor tier list that you just clicked on. While I'm not the first one to rank the survivors of Willamette, every tier list I found was solely on how annoying they found them, and how useful they were for achievements. I agree that overall gameplay is king, but it's not the only factor. These are stories, events, side quests, and, of course, characters. So naturally my tier list will have a few extra stipulations. While I'm not taking all of the speedrun strats into account, I will be looking at this as a perfect playthrough, saving every survivor and getting the true ending, while starting from level 1, and from someone who has taken the time to learn how the survivor types work. This is because, once you know how the survivor AI works, survivors are universally tolerable, and when you don't know how the AI works, they're universally frustrating. I'll be arming every survivor when possible, and adjusting my movement speed to work with them when possible. Consider this me giving them their best possible chance for the tier list. Survivors will be tiered in their scoops. Only 2 survivors are of a drastically different caliber from their scoop group, and both are in their respective groups for a reason. And if you're saving survivors, you're ideally trying to save all of them. Aaron may be much worse than Bert, but they're a package deal. Smaller details include the survivor's route, time of day, and if they can be reasonably escorted with other survivors. The survivors' interactions, personalities, and stories will also be considered. They're all part of the experience, after all. I will not be using the exploit that lets you give weapons to survivors who aren't meant to be able to use them, although exploits to make their movement or pathfinding better are fair game. Photo opportunities that require the survivor dying are not factored in. Finally, only scoop survivors count. Story characters and victims will be ignored. Okay, enough pre-planning. Let's head out and get the job done. Man, I wish this game had a skip dialogue button. Gordon has some interesting traits in his mission. First, it's implied that he's the coward Todd and Brian are talking about in the entrance plaza, and when you talk to him, his conversation loops because he's too scared to actually talk to you. The only way to help him is to hit him and make him more afraid of you than what's out there. And making him bald was a great design choice, showing just how easily stressed out he was before all of this. So, even the worst Dead Rising survivor has more interesting traits to him than most open-world NPCs get. That said, he is the worst survivor, and no amount of cleverness can overcome that. His running speed can keep up with Frank, but there's no easy way to get him back to the security room. He's about as far from Cliff's mission as one can get as well. So, do you try to escort him through Al Fresca Plaza and pray he doesn't get grabbed mid-trip in the most densely populated part of the mall? Or do you try to bring him through the park into Cliff, praying that neither the convicts nor the combat veteran rip him apart on sight? Or do you take him through Wonderland Plaza and take the longest possible time and still have to backtrack for Cliff's hostages? What hurts the most is that he's a cowardly survivor. These survivors only attack if you press the Y button when they're next to you, meaning they're a struggle to defend themselves. Except for Gordon. He outright refuses to, even at the best of times. Oh, and that run speed can actually work against you. If level ups have not been kind to you, Frank can end up slower than Gordon is, resulting in a constantly stopping and starting Gordon, making it even easier for him to get grabbed and zombo comboed. Worst of all, is that he doesn't give any more prestige points than the easier to get survivors at that point in the game, and it's literally just better to take candid pictures of Jesse. Thanks to how rare erotica photos are, they give really good prestige points, and Jesse has a chance for a surefire 1000 PP pick every time, especially if you have the camera books. You can take 30 pictures of her, go outside to refill the camera, and then take 30 more and end up with more PP than if you took that time to save Gordon before Case 3 activates. That's what puts him in E tier. He's the only survivor who's arguably better for leveling up by ignoring in favor of taking pictures. Or at least waiting until the last possible minute to save. Ronald is the opposite of Gordon. His interaction is pretty standard. He's a fat guy who wants some food because he's fat. The first game really wanted commentary on American obesity, so it's natural that a survivor like him would exist. And while Gordon is the worst survivor mechanically, Ronald is one of the best. He's every bit as competent with firearms as Bill or Kendall is, and he has a 10k PP photo opportunity. So what's he doing near the bottom? Well, his combat stats aren't very helpful. The distance to the security room is pretty short, and while none of the possible survivors whom Frank is likely to be with are particularly capable fighters, none of them are in need of direct assistance either. Since Frank won't have his hands full and you'll have some level ups by now, there's just less of a need for some covering fire. And then there's his personality. I hate him. He is the most unlikable survivor in the game. Every bit of his dialogue is just talking about food, and he is easily the most selfish and ungrateful survivor in the game, despite being the only survivor who actively needs something to be recruited. He doesn't get any better after you save him. He only comes to the security room to eat all the food reserves and ends up causing a shortage, demanding more. So you need to bring back some food after defeating the Hall family, or he'll take most of the survivors you save on day 1 to go scavenge for more food, dooming them to die. And he's the only survivor who negatively impacts the map, as Jill's sandwiches will no longer have food after his mission activates, even if you never interact with him. The park will certainly still have the convicts roaming about, and the movie theater will be swarmed with cultists. So there's already very little reason to go to the further half of Paradise Plaza. Now that there's no food on that half either, most players will never use anything past the Wonderland shortcut unless a mission demands so. Thanks, Ronald. And thanks to how mutinies work, you need to have food before entering the security room for his mutiny, as leaving will instantly cause the mission to expire and have 10 plus survivors leave. If Ronald was not such a capable survivor mechanically speaking, he'd be the only F tier, as he's the one survivor who can actively make the player experience worse, both by saving him and simply by existing. Completing the bottom triforce of survivors, Jennifer is the most boring survivor in the game, characterization-wise. She's simply a reward for defeating the Raincoat cult upon their introduction, without getting killed or knocked out. She gives the player a natural reason to deal with them, and she's not very far from the security room. And unlike Ronald or Gordon, she's at least both cooperative and grateful. But female survivors are at a disadvantage in the first Dead Rising. First is health, as every gal aside from Isabella only has 3.5 blocks of health, and Jennifer is a passive survivor. This subtype is exclusive to some of the female survivors, and it refers to characters who, while not strictly crippled, cannot be armed with a weapon and instead are escortable by hand. This isn't as big of a deal as you might think, since their push attack is actually more useful than the common survivor punch, and it immediately floors whatever zombie they hit. This can even cause a domino effect against small clusters, so keeping them away from cultists and really large hordes is the only real concern. But Jennifer doesn't get that luxury. Sure, no other cultists will spawn in the area until you reload it, but the other half of Paradise is swarming, and if you didn't pick up Gordon, Ronald, and Cliff's hostages in a single trip, you'll have to either carry her by hand through the horde, or manually kill as many as possible to minimize her damage. It's still very doable, but it makes her one of the more annoying survivors to bring back despite how close she is, and she's not a particularly interesting character to make up for it. These two spawn alongside the sniper family, and this is actually one half mission, one half unmarked mission. You see, much like Taurus or Barricade Pair, this is actually 2 missions, but Otis only calls you about the one relating to Jolie. Rachel's version of the mission is actually unmarked. Think of how the Barricade Pair or Taurus get 2 separate missions, one for each survivor. I do appreciate that it's just a case of 2 friends who disagreed on where to hide, and both are terrified and regretting their choice. They're our first example of tether survivors, meaning one survivor will only follow the other, Rachel being tethered to Jolie in this case. This means that Rachel will always be lagging behind a bit, so zombies attracted to Jolie but failing to reach her can easily change targets to Rachel. But if Jolie gets grabbed, Rachel will stop beside her, and while she's not as cowardly as Gordon, she still hesitates to attack. so she won't save Jolie and often gets grabbed and or zombo comboed herself. And both are passive survivors, so you're not arming them. This gets really bad with Jolie, since she's technically a normal survivor personality-wise, and will try to attack the Raincoat cult without a weapon, which spells her death if you don't stop her. You'll often be escorting Floyd, who benefits from being carried, and Wayne's fast movement speed means he'll be next to you instead of them. Most people don't find them too frustrating since they're so close to the security room, and their photo op gives some really good PP, but they're always a holdup when bringing the Hall family refugees to safety. The first hostages on the tier list, which just means you need to defeat a psychopath to save them. Well, technically Jennifer was a hostage as well, but it was more appropriate to bring it up here. All three have different dialogue available, and Frank has a different means of convincing the group based on which one he talks to. Josh specifically ends up feeling bad for Cliff upon the group's arrival to the security room, believing that he was probably a nice guy before all this happened. But while all three can be armed with weapons, even shotguns, a rarity for female survivors, they're all cowardly. Not as bad as Gordon, in fact as far as cowards go, they're perfectly functional, but you'll still need to tap the Y button every time you want them to attack, and there's no guarantee that they will. As such, it's often just better to use the guns yourself, give them a melee weapon, and try to keep them out of the way. They're not particularly helpful, but at least they follow Frank somewhat reliably, if not slowly. Leia might be the saddest survivor in the game. Listening to her describe losing her baby to the zombies is heart-wrenching. Or rather, reading it is. Because what you're listening to is... Now, to be fair, this is the fault of the game's lack of unique voice lines. But at the same time, the lack of voice acting during gameplay is a non-issue the rest of the time. Having her reuse the zombie grapple animation to make it look like she's frantically asking Frank about Grace doesn't look right. And then there's rescuing her. Leia is the first example of an impaired survivor on the list, and frankly, in the game. Not only can they not equip weapons, but often can barely move. And in Leia's case, she's not alone en route to the security room. If it was just Bill and Bert going with you, it'd be fine. But Aaron is more of a detriment to her survival than his own, since him getting zombo comboed means you'll have to put her down and go save him. Leia also has one of the slowest movement speeds in the game, but she also never gets tired, so she'll at least slowly pull herself to any position. Without exaggeration, Leia would at least be the top of C tier if Dead Rising had the option to skip dialogue. Something that holds both Leia and Floyd back in this tier list is how their interactions are nothing but talking. Floyd's conversation, while not as tragic, is still sad and more involved. Floyd is talking about how he doesn't even value surviving since he's so old already, instead wanting to die on his terms. And Frank correctly points out that he would probably regret dying in a crappy pawn shop instead of living to see a museum again. It's strong stuff. Unlike Leia, Frank and Floyd are having an actual back and forth conversation. And it's good that the dialogue is engaging, because that's all there is. He doesn't have any of the annoying voice lines that Leia spams, but he doesn't really have much in the way of voice lines, period. He's not animated in the slightest until the very end of the conversation, and it's one of the longest conversations in the game to boot. Floyd would also really benefit from a skip dialogue button for repeat playthroughs. As for his escort, he's interesting. He has respectable running speed for what is technically a crippled survivor, but he'll have to slow down periodically to catch his breath. This can be mitigated by picking him up and putting him down immediately to reset the cycle, and if you make sure to never go further than what his max move distance will be, he'll actually never end up getting tired. Manual escorting is still faster though, and both Jolie and Rachel suffer from his piggyback ride. Floyd is also a survivor who has a request, in his case for some wine, which cements him as a step above Leia. Much like his proper scoop, the dialogue is the draw. He wants some wine to help calm the nerves of the survivors, well aware it's not going to fix the long-term problems, but it might help lighten things up. The reward is a basic 10,000 prestige points, which isn't a big deal by that point in the game. The mission is useful for another reason, but we'll get to that later in the tier list. These two are found right next to Joe Slade's mission, making them hard to miss despite being unmarked survivors. Their initial situation is attention-grabbing, as they're hanging on for dear life above massive hordes of zombies. Not only do you have to clear out the hordes below them, but you then need to damage them to knock them loose. Nick is the only survivor who actively begs for Frank's guidance, and Sally merely confirms that she's fine. This gives the two of them some contrast. This creates a bit of contrast between the two, as Nick is an easily panicked man who can still be armed with weapons, while Sally cannot be given weapons, but remains calm and rational. Despite this and their matching outfits, they aren't tethered survivors and don't even acknowledge each other. The player will be escorting Joe's survivors at the same time in most playthroughs. Nick's combat abilities are no better than Kay's beyond being able to use a shotgun, while Sally's inability to use weapons doesn't matter, since the other hostages also can't use weapons, and Sally is much quicker to respond and follow Frank than they are. So Nick's not terribly helpful, but Sally doesn't hold the player up. Overall, very average survivors after the mission itself is cleared. Speaking of average, everything of note about Tad doesn't directly relate to him as a character. If you don't show up immediately for Kent's request, Tad is already dead. His dialogue implies that he met Kent for the first time when he tied him up, and his rescue dialogue is him hoping Frank doesn't snap like Kent did. He's a perfectly capable survivor, but he's so close to the warehouse, and the zombie count is going to be non-existent after the mission is cleared, so there's no need to even arm him outside of personal amusement. He's the reward for seeing Kent through to the end, but there's nothing actually frustrating with him mechanically nor personality-wise. There is a behind-the-scenes detail with him, though. Dead Rising has a limit of 8 active survivors. This limit operates on a first-come, first-served basis, and if there aren't enough slots for a mission to take place, the mission is put on hold until space is made, assuming the paused mission doesn't expire. Characters like the intro plaza survivors, Brad, Isabella, and psychopaths don't count towards this limit. Interestingly, neither does Tad. Since Kent's side quests activate as soon as the last one is successfully cleared, and because they're treated as optional case files for whatever reason, Tad spawning counts as an event, so he can be a 9th survivor. He will be factored into the limit once he does spawn, though. To my knowledge, there is no practical application of this knowledge. Similar to Tad, these two are very close to the security room, so Pamela's inability to use weapons and Heather's reluctance to fight are trivial details, instead of deciding factors. Pamela is surrounded by a lot of zombies, so have a queen on standby if you're not confident in your melee attacks. Heather is not particularly proud of herself for leaving her twin behind, but the dialogue is pretty cut and dry with her, whereas Pamela is grateful to Frank both when recruited and brought back to safety. On that note, Heather and Pamela's lines feel very disconnected, and the game doesn't have any actual proper conversations between them like the other tether survivors in the game do, probably because they can be saved independently of each other. On that note, Pamela is the only tether survivor who can be saved independently of her alpha, since she only becomes tethered to Heather when they reunite. You could choose to save Pamela and go back to the security room, then go back for Heather, and keep her with you until Kent and Ronald's missions activate. This is helpful if you're still escorting Tanya and Ross when they spawn, and you need to get the medicine back ASAP. Alternatively, Pamela instantly joins when Heather is brought back to her. Starting on day 2, the optional side quests become much stricter with their time limit, and it becomes much easier to fall behind. So it's nice that these two have a bit of adaptability during their start of this hectic cycle. It's what gets them this high to begin with. These four have the misfortune of being held up by the only psychopath who actively attacks the hostages during the fight, and it makes them some of the only survivors with a high chance of dying before being recruited. Then there's the timer. If the player takes too long to even start this side quest, one or more of the hostages will already be dead at the start of the fight. Thankfully, the mission gives the player plenty of time before this can happen. As long as the timer is still blue, you're still good. It's also nice how all four ladies have different reactions to being saved. Lily is just exhausted by the whole ordeal, Kelly is in disbelief, Janet is a bit traumatized, and Kay is outright pissed. Kay is also the only one of the four who can be armed with a weapon, and she's mildly competent with a handgun or SMG. Honestly, getting the four of them down the staircase is the hardest part of their rescue. After that, it's just making sure that you kill any cultists in Paradise Plaza before escorting them to the warehouse. After that, you're pretty much home free. Levoy is the classic trope of the vaguely injured survivor. Might be infected, might just be a scratch. Might be starting the turn, might just be tired and stressed out. His banter is all about the juxtaposition of Frank's demanding tone and Levoy trying to ensure the injury, which Frank doesn't know about, is surely just a scratch. The weird thing is, zombies seem especially attracted to this area when talking to Levoy. I've been playing this game for over a decade personally, and every time, at least 5 to 6 zombies make a sprint to Frank and Levoy when the conversation starts, no matter the route I take. Is that deliberate? Levoy is the one survivor I'm a bit let down in. He's just a normal male survivor, mechanically speaking. Whether or not his combat abilities will help depends on if the gun shop trio tagged along with you to Wonderland Plaza or not. But his injury and nervousness don't carry into gameplay at all. I can understand not doing what Shop to You Drop did, where Leroy's health would slowly deplete over the trip back to the security room, but you'd also think a mutiny of some kind would occur over his injury. I know, weird thing to ask for. But it complements Simone's request for a gun in case she turns. He's too unique and, plausibly, useful to be any lower than B tier, but he's the one survivor I think more could have and should have been done with. David is a rare case of foreshadowing for a Dead Rising survivor, as he was shot by someone that we would soon come to know very well in the supermarket. Frank refusing to say he's one of the good guys is one of his more dickish moments, but he also offers to help David completely unprompted, so you get both sides of Frank's personality here. He's also wearing a wedding ring, although David's wife is never brought up, so I'm assuming she passed away well before any of this took place. Personality-wise, David is one of the more straightforward, if not nicer survivors you encounter. His real benefit is with Cletus, who has the single longest-lasting mission in the game, lasting for almost all of days 1 and 2, but there aren't many convenient opportunities to head down to the gun store to deal with him, especially once day 2 rolls around. David's scoop occurs during the downtime between Adam's fight and Carlito's rematch, giving the player a good excuse to visit North Plaza and deal with the gun shop owner. And, thanks to the Wonderland Plaza shortcut, it won't take long to get him back. Wayne is a fast and combat-capable survivor, but he's practically right next to the warehouse, and you're escorting some of the slowest survivors at the same time, so you won't be able to take advantage of either of those traits. His combat skills are better for keeping Jolie and Rachel safe while you go talk to Floyd than they are at actually escorting them. What puts Wayne up to B tier is similar to David, in that he ties into a psychopath, in this case, the very battle he's involved in. At first, it's just irony. Wayne is too scared to run against the snipers, despite the fact that he's the one survivor fast enough to avoid their gunfire. But there's an implication many people miss. In the cutscene, Roger and Jack are not particularly impressed with Thomas, and are dismissive of his ability to hit an unaware civilian. So, imagine a large man like Wayne, ideally an easy target. Thomas whiffs the shot against him, and Wayne takes off like a rocket up to the 2nd floor. and manages to get behind cover before anyone else can take another shot at him. When you take that into account, Wayne quite literally completes the story of the whole family. Simone is another survivor who is mostly dialogue, and is right next to the warehouse. If you're not going for transmissionary, you can even just grab her right after beating Kent, since her mission activates at the same time. She's capable of using lighter weapons, but even if you head out of Paradise Plaza for whatever reason, she's the single closest survivor to the warehouse outside of the twins. And you'll also have Tad with you. It's her scenario that sets her apart. You have to get far enough into the game for Barnaby to die to save her. Simone has been bitten and believes herself to be doomed. Frank will have to have heard that Isabel is a medical technician, which only happens after zombie Barnaby attacks Jesse. Otherwise, Frank's comment of "you don't have to turn into one of them" becomes baseless optimism that fails to sway her. The failed scenario is also how you learn about her backstory. The rest of her family and her boyfriend had already turned. Oh, as an aside, in the promotional blog for Dead Rising 2, a character mentions it's possible to get bit and not turn if the bite's not deep, and you're lucky. This is just meant to be a hand-wave explanation for why Chuck never turns in Dead Rising 2, but it retroactively gives Levoy and Simone a plausible means of surviving Willamette in the long term. These two serve a mechanical purpose for newer players, teaching them about books if the player hasn't interacted with them yet. Due to limited voice lines, they never audibly speak Japanese, but their banter is quite amusing on whether Frank can be trusted or if he's even mentally stable. Ironic, given a psychopath stalks the area they're hiding in. I love Shinji just blatantly saying Frank's Japanese sucks so he won't understand a word of what they're saying immediately afterwards. Mechanically, beyond their sudden grasp of the English language, they're tether survivors, with Shinji following Yu. Both are pretty combat capable, although Yu is definitely the more aggressive of the two. They correspond really well with Greg, as you can save them right after you defeat Adam but before you stop the ride, allowing you to navigate a clean upper level of the Wonderland Plaza, and a chance to grab the criminal biology book for the small chainsaw before you have to use it. They also have a photo opportunity worth some good PP early in the game. Similar to Levoy, I'm surprised there's no request for them in the security room, especially given how early you bring them back. Given the Japanese book never gets used again, a side quest of you asking for the book so he can try to talk to the other survivors would be pretty nice. Gil's side quest activates at the same time of Floyd's request for some wine, but Gil is very much tied to that 8 survivor limit. Thanks to the Raincoat Cult and the Gunshop Trio, 8 survivors can easily be in the mall before Gil's mission begins. If you don't know how to manipulate the spawn to ensure Gil, you'll have to escort him with the Wonderland Plaza squad, which itself is quite frustrating thanks to Gil needing some help to move. Thankfully, I know the trick, so it's a non-factor. I'll explain how to do it later in the tier list. As for Gil himself, his mission seems like it should be where Leia and Floyd are, if not lower given what I just mentioned, as it's another dialogue-only mission. But Gil has a lot of unique aspects to him. Almost all of his animations are rarely used with other survivors, while offering a very rare photo opportunity. His repeating voice lines are, instead of high-pitched crying, a low and jovial drunken laugh. This carries into his dialogue, offering Frank a drink and then justifying his own drunken stupor as Frank tries to get him to come back with him to safety. Similar to Gordon, Gil can't just be talked to, but hitting him won't sober him up. It's only when Frank threatens to abandon Gil that the reporter's words start to sink in. Once he realizes Frank isn't BSing, Gil agrees to follow him. The Raincoat Cult will likely still be active if you do this as soon as possible, but this actually ends up being a good thing. The cult being in Alfresca Plaza will result in a less dense zombie population. This makes Gil the only survivor you would actively want to take through Alfresca, allowing Frank to get back to the security room in time for Case 6, even faster than the Wonderland shortcut allows for. Unlike Floyd or Leia, I actually don't mind having to sit through the dialogue each time. Gil's just that entertaining. always took it that Jeff and Natalie were by both exits to the rooftop because they thought the other was just behind them and wanted to stay there in case that's how they got up there. Regardless, these two serve as the introduction to many core mechanics. Obviously, they're the first survivors, and teach the player how to escort them. But they also teach that survivors can use weapons, be given weapons, need to be talked to be saved, that survivors are characters whose motivation affect their performance, and it displays the tether system, with Natalie always following Jeff. I guess Natalie is technically the other survivor who can be saved independently of her alpha, but there's no reason to do this. They also show new players that the rooftop has 2 doors to the warehouse, and gives them a chance to learn about the soccer balls that spawn on the roof. They also give the first photo opportunity. Now, you can bring them with you into the mall, but why would you? The zombie count is minuscule, and the PP you gain for their rescue is far more valuable than any covering fire Jeff can provide. In fact, their level ups are the most important in the game. Jeff and Natalie with their photo op and rescue can get Frank to level 3. The ideal perks to get are health blocks, inventory space, the jump kick, and or a speed upgrade. But which, if any of these perks you get early game, will determine what you can take with you from Paradise Plaza to the rest of the mall, as well as how you go about dealing with zombies for the first hour or so. While as far as characters go, they're the typical older devoted couple, they have some of the most pronounced effects on the early game. Their lack of direct involvement with the gameplay is what keeps them just out of A tier. Susan gets to A tier for one reason alone. She's the funniest survivor in the game. From pleading with the zombies that they wouldn't want to eat someone who's half plastic and bolts, to Frank taking offense to being called a boy, Susan's laid-back attitude is just a welcome change of pace from a late-game survivor. You'll have to manually escort her since, like Floyd, she'll get tired as she runs, and she's noticeably slow to boot. But from plenty of combat-capable survivors to Mindy also desiring, although not strictly needing, direct guidance, this is hardly an issue. And that's it. Susan is a survivor who's not a hassle to deal with and has the funniest interaction in the game. Helps to have a queen. Oh boy, these two. Possibly the most infamous survivors in the game, thanks to the beginner trap they set. Don't give him the gun. I find it weird that the first aid kit from 2-3 doesn't get referenced at all in the dialogue. I also find it weird that this is the only group of Tether survivors where Frank actively talks to both of them beyond single-sentence requests. But it also makes Tanya and Ross's dialogue among the most emotional and convincing in the game. It's also meant to be another case of foreshadowing, as it's meant to imply that Joe Slade tried to kidnap Tanya and shot Ross, but the two managed to escape and hide on the other side of the plaza. Combined with Janet's comment from the boss fight, it gives an idea of just how far-reaching Joe's sadism was. Ross can't move on his own at all, but Tanya is a very capable fighter and gunslinger, so as long as you don't book it, she can effectively escort herself and Ross. In fact, here's a little secret about escorting survivors. Slower is faster. If you have to carry a survivor manually, or if you have several of them armed with guns, take your time and let them shoot down the zombies. It'll minimize the grapples against them, and often you, and thin the horde down. And it makes carrying survivors like Ross much easier. It's also what makes them higher than most. Unlike Leia or Floyd, Ross is injured with a survivor who operates as a guardian built into the scoop. Mindy and Debbie can be saved as soon as Paul goes on the offensive. He does not need to be beaten, saved, or killed to recruit them. Paul prioritizes Frank over other survivors to boot, so you could safely escort them right away if time is getting dire. Also, none of the three have the personality you'd quite expect. Debbie is mostly defined by being impressed with Frank's skills, Mindy is very calm and collective given what happened, and Paul just wants Frank to not report on what he did. This is likely because Mindy and Debbie can be saved independently of Paul, but even in the safe house, they never start arguing if all three are brought back. Mindy and Debbie just casually talk with each other, and Paul keeps to himself in the corner. Paul is also the single most profitable survivor in terms of PP. 30,000 PP for his defeat, 2 10k photo ops, 30,000 PP for his recruit, 60,000 PP for his survival, and another 10k for his request. Said request also gives the player access to Molotovs, but they're not very helpful for how late in the game they're given to you. And once Otis evacuates your survivors, Paul won't be there to give you anymore. It's the PP that's Paul's biggest asset. Those unique traits definitely carry them, but they're also pretty good survivors in their own right. Debbie and Paul can both use shotguns, and Mindy is the single most hassle-free unarmed survivor in the game, since she follows Frank's orders with ease. They're standout survivors who offer no real issues getting them back to safety, beyond your own ability to get them back in time. The ideal side quest for a Dead Rising game. While Paul is the single most profitable survivor, Sean's hostages offer the most PP of any survivor group, offering 375,000 for recruiting and saving all 5 hostages, that number going just over 400,000 if Sean's defeat is counted. Yeah, having 5 people tied up in one place behind a boss battle will do that. Their personalities aren't as immediately striking as Joe's crew, with most either being grateful to Frank or angry at the cult, understandably. The rescue dialogue implies they were already in the movie theater when the outbreak happened, and they were still holed up in there when the cult took the theater over. The 4 main survivors can all be armed with weapons, and Beth can even be armed with a shotgun. 3 shotguns and an SMG make the trek back to the security room much more bearable, although not quite trivial given how overflown with zombies Paradise becomes after the cult falls. It also makes it easier to escort Cheryl, the only timid survivor of the group. She's also the biggest focus of them, being held separately from the other hostages, and having a special request for Frank to photograph her. Given these are high-value erotica pictures, the rarest photo category, it makes a side quest worthy of anywhere from 30 to 40,000 PP, if all 3 photo books are held. I considered putting Cheryl into S tier, away from the other 4 as an exception to the rule, since her request is easily the most profitable in the game. However, given the special forces are much better at grinding PP in the endgame of a run, and how helpful the other 4 are at keeping her safe if armed with guns from the gun store, I'm content labeling all 5 as a good batch for their PP value alone. These survivors open fire once Frank approaches them, and escaping can be a problem if you habitually close the door on yourself. It's the ventilation picture, something that's easy to forget even for veteran players, that keeps them at the bottom of S tier. Fun fact about that picture, the game doesn't check your camera since it can't save the subject matter of any given photo, and instead checks the list of available photo opportunities. Those aren't just for survivors, but the environment as well. The PP stickers are just there to visualize them. If the photo opportunity for the ventilation shaft is no longer available, then the game knows the player found it. That's why you need to retake the vent photo for each playthrough, but Ken's erotica picture can be from any playthrough. Only photo ops reset. As for the survivors themselves, they have an interesting trichotomy. Brett serves as the quiet leader of the trio and is armed with a machine gun. It's not clear if it's his or if he simply managed to loot a dead Special Forces member, but he definitely has the most militant personality of the 3. Jonathan serves as the face of them, and he's the one who actually talks with Frank throughout the mission. Eliza is the most revealing, though. She's the only survivor in the whole game who made an effort to get to the security room after it was welded shut. Her bubbly demeanor, completely different sense of dress, and Jonathan's outburst at her implies that these 3 didn't know each other before all this went down, or at least that Eliza met up with them after the fact. As for the gameplay, they have the combat capabilities of the cult hostages and the adaptability of the twins. While you can be bold and take them with you to the cult hideout, it's generally preferable to either take them back to the security room on their own, or bring them with you to Wonderland Plaza. Luckily, they're natural gunslingers, and the only survivors who could realistically handle a full trip through North Plaza. Eliza is more prone to having to pause to cry than Jonathan or Brett are, but the stop-and-start nature of escorting them so that way they can shoot down the hordes of zombies mean anyone lagging behind will have time to catch up. Eliza herself is perhaps the most competent survivor with handheld firearms as well. And all three of them just make for natural bodyguards when it comes time to bring everyone from Wonderland Plaza back to the security room. Bill, having been trapped in the closet for 2 days straight, is none the wiser about the zombie outbreak. This, along with him being so good with firearms and being the first real survivor you have to escort to the security room, secures him the S tier. So, instead, allow me to explain something. Survivors have different aggro radiuses and conditions. There's the range where they will attack zombies of their own volition, then there's the range where they'll attack on Frank's command, and finally there's a follow-up range where they're willing to keep attacking after they initiated an attack. Every survivor has at least one of these three, although which ones and how many can vary. Female survivors who can't be armed have a single priority cube, but some, like Sophie and Jolie, have longer attack ranges for when Frank calls to action. Cowardly survivors can also have more than one. Aaron, Natalie, and Nick all only have on-command aggro ranges, but Nick's aggro range is still pretty good, and he has follow-up capabilities, so he's still considered combat capable. So when I say that a survivor is combat capable, it means that they can be armed with firearms and can be effective with them. And when I say Bill is one of the most combat effective survivors in the game, know that means that the first survivor you find in the mall proper can cover a very long range. And with Aaron, Leia, and Sophie all in need of some help, every armed set of arms helps. Sophie is the only survivor in the series who isn't directly a hostage of the corresponding boss fight, even when compared to Paul or the cult. As such, it's very possible to just save her and ignore the convicts until later, should you be too ill-equipped to deal with them at the moment, or if you just want to save the heavy machine gun for Adam the Clown. On her own, you can lead her by hand directly, but she's a fairly loyal survivor and pretty good at following orders. Her personality is, understandably, almost nothing but distraught over the death of Sid at the hands of the convicts. Her best trait was unintentional, however. You can take pictures of her sitting down, and for some reason, they count as upskirt shots. A little overly generous, but they're worth some serious prestige points. Given that a single PP sticker is worth 1,000, being able to use the initial photography book and earn 900 PP a photo from her is far more valuable than photographing the environment itself. And remember, you can just go back to Paradise Plaza to instantly recharge your camera. So you can take 30 pictures, go recharge, and take 30 more. This can double or even triple the PP value Sophie offers, enough to compete with late-game survivors. And best of all, the game hands the player the perfect opportunity to do this. Once you've optimized your routes, you're left with a bit of a dead period before Case 2 starts. You got everyone from the mall at this point, Adam's defeated, and you beat Cletus when you went to save David. You have a good 5 to 10 real-time minutes of nothing better to do. May as well get a free level up or two before you have to do 2 back-to-back psychopaths. Without this, Sophie would have likely made it to high B, or maybe even have gotten into the A tier because of how cooperative she is. But giving the player a free 50,000 prestige points while helping kill time, I can't think of anyone else who does that. This is actually a pretty controversial choice, as there's a lot of debate on how useful Kendall actually is to the player. Kendall is meant to help you escort Isabella back to safety, but since carrying a survivor means Frank's immune to grapples, some players wish Kendall wouldn't bother showing up, as they could just rush Isabella back immediately to the security room. Kendall being capable of shooting Frank and making him drop Isabella is not helping his case. However, if you remember that slower is faster when escorting gun-wielding survivors, you can activate Kendall's secret utility, spawn manipulation. So, at midnight on day 3, Kendall spawns alongside the cult hostages. At 1 AM, the gunshop trio would spawn if there was room for them, but there are only 2 free slots, so they have to wait for now. They will spawn if Kendall dies or makes it to the security room too quickly. This brings in the gunshop trio and stops Gil from spawning alongside Floyd's request, since there's no free spaces whatsoever. This means you either have to save Gil or the gunshop trio individually after you take care of the cult, or choose to get everybody and then come back for Susan, an unmarked survivor with a very short scoop duration. Regardless, you're forcing a third trip at a point when time is getting increasingly scarce. But if you wait until 2 AM to bring Kendall and Isabella back in one piece, Gil will have a chance to take one of the 2 free spots, resulting in a very easy rescue and setting up the gunshop trio for the Wonderland Plaza survivors. All of that, however, depends on Kendall. And then there's the character himself. Armed with a shotgun and an escape plan, Kendall is the only survivor who is actively exploring the mall instead of taking cover. It's believed that he was going through North Plaza to look for weapons and survivors to proceed with his escape plan, which serves as the basis for his mutiny, as he finds Frank's helicopter rescue to be too good to be true. All you have to do is talk to him while the time bombs are ticking, making it more of an inconvenience than anything. But compared to the terrified survivors Frank regularly encounters, and the selfishness of Ronald's gluttony-fueled crisis, Kendall is a respectable fighter with an understandable characterization. He has the longest attack range of any character in the game, and a really useful trick to make the final batch of survivors far more manageable. Greg is the most important survivor in the game. The shortcut alone does this, as the ability to jump from one side of the map to the other is invaluable, to say nothing of that other side of the map being where a third of the side quests and the small chainsaw are located. But on top of that, Greg is just a good survivor. His dialogue is simply him thanking Frank, asking about other survivors, and showing him a shortcut. And of course his excitement to see that there's another surviving employee of the Parkview Mall. The actual escort can get a bit annoying since he waits for you if you get even a modest distance away, and his photo opportunity is one of the hardest ones to get the full value of. But man, that shortcut. Even players who ignore survivors will often go out of their way to escort him not just to the shortcut, but even back to the security room since he's just that close by the time you take it. And when going after every other survivor, it turns nigh impossible escorts like Above the Law or Long-Haired Punk into some of the shorter treks back to the security room. Without Greg's shortcut, half of the survivors would be an entire tier lower than their current position. And there we have it. Every survivor ranked. Even bundled by Scoop, that took a hot minute. It was interesting to stop and actually think about the survivors. I always had my favorites and frustrations, but this is the first time I ever put them from worst to best. It was probably weird to ignore the survivor AI given how infamous it is for this game, but that's something I've just learned to work around, and it's something that varies heavily from player to player, so I wanted to minimize its impact. I hope this video was at least a bit informative for some of the details for the Dead Rising 1 survivors. Thank you all for 1,000 subscribers, and thank you for watching. While I do try to make the videos that I would like to make, you guys are what keep these videos worth making.
Yes.